Welcome, everyone, to this comprehensive lesson on marketing mix ROI analysis. I am Anton Trofimenko, an independent CheckMedia consultant specializing in marketing mix modeling. Today, I'm joining you through my AI-powered digital avatar to guide you through this material. First of all, I would like to point out the various topics that we will be covering in this particular video lesson. So generally, our client engagement process is broken down into 5 key stages. First, we have the kickoff call. This is where we get the client on board and walk them through how we'll be working together. Next up is the briefing and data collection phase. Here, we sit down with the client to align on their main goals and KPIs, and we gather all their historical marketing and sales data. Once we have that, we move on to building the model. We take all that information, upload it to our platform, and start constructing the model. After that, we analyze the model results and prepare a presentation. We dive deep into the output, see what the model tells us, and then develop a set of tailored recommendations based on the client's initial objectives. And finally, we build optimization scenarios to recommend ways to optimize customer acquisition cost and boost efficiency. So in today's lesson, we're going to cover steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 and go through a practical example. First, we will look at an example of a completed client brief and understand how to transfer the contents of this brief into the MediaMix platform for analysis. Next, we will go through the process of building a model on the platform, learn how to interpret the results obtained, and understand how to use them to answer the client's questions and tasks outlined in the brief. We will also learn how to create several optimization scenarios on the platform, and as the final result of this video lesson, we will prepare a standard report for the client with the analysis results. This video lesson will be especially useful and highly beneficial for marketers, analysts, and media strategists. In other words, for anyone who truly wants to understand how to effectively evaluate the overall effectiveness of marketing investments and their impact. Let's now begin our comprehensive lesson and move on to the very first important point, namely, let's carefully look at an illustrative example of a thoroughly completed client brief. A brief is an Excel file that contains a lot of different tabs, each with various information. The Brief tab displays the main information about the product, as well as the tasks and hypotheses set by the client. Let's take a closer look at this together. It would be helpful if we reviewed all the information the client provided for this particular case. We're going to take a look at a large regional brand that produces and sells non-alcoholic beverages. And its main focus is on lemonades made from natural ingredients. This main SKU of lemonades, made from natural ingredients, is distributed in the largest region of the country, where it currently holds a distribution coverage of 95%, with shelf presence in the top 5 grocery retailers. We are also given information that from January 2022 to October 2023 inclusive, the average price per bottle for the main SKU was €2.50. But starting from November 2023, there was a 40% price increase, and the final retail price per bottle became €3.50. At the same time, the profit margin per bottle sold for the company is about 30%. The client also provided information about seasonality, that is, about the organic sales growth of the non-alcoholic beverages category. And they noted here that the main surge happens during the summer months, and it also partially affects the spring months. So, the growth period in the category starts in April and lasts through August. Among the main competitors are all the largest producers of non-alcoholic beverages in the same region where the brand's main SKU is represented. Brand awareness is 27%, according to research. There are 2 main communication channels, namely TV and OLV advertising. The target audience for the placement is adults aged 18 to 65. The key business KPI is sales, measured by the number of bottles of the main SKU sold. As we understood from the description above, these are lemonades made from natural ingredients. The analysis period under consideration is from January 2023 to the end of 2024 inclusive. So that's a full 2 years. The sections below describe the main tasks and hypotheses that we need to test as part of this analysis. The first task is to calculate each marketing channel's contribution. We have 2, TV and OLV advertising, so we need to understand each channel's effect. The second task is to assess the payback period for media investments for the 2 channels. In other words, the client assumes the payback periods will differ between them. The third task is to evaluate the investment potential of these channels. That is, to determine which channel should receive more investment and which one less. The last task is to build an effective media strategy with a planned budget of 2 million euros for 2025 and to create a sales forecast for the period. That is, to understand the expected number of bottles to be sold in 2025 under the proposed optimization strategy, based on a planned budget of 2 million euros for that year. The client also pointed out one of the hypotheses that needs to be tested during the analysis, namely, their belief that the 40% increase in retail price in November 2023 had only a minor impact on sales volume in bottles of our main SKU. We will skip the additional analytics tab. This video lesson does not cover the information on that tab. So let's move on to the next one, namely the dataset glossary. This tab essentially serves as a reference for what will later be displayed in the final dataset from the client. So, what do we see here? Essentially, we see that the dataset includes detailed data on regional TV advertising and ratings, OLV advertising and impressions, and price changes, which are also shown in the dataset in euros. There's the actual price value, along with the initial and a dummy variable, which is basically tracking the event itself. For example, if there was a specific price increase, ones will indicate that the price went up, and 0 will mean it was the initial price per bottle. This is really just to make the analysis clearer and easier. And then there's also the seasonal index, which will help show us when there's organic growth in the category during certain key weeks of the year. Alright, let's move on now to the Dataset Metrics tab itself, which contains the main information that will be used later for building the model and further analysis. This tab is already conveniently presented in a weekly format. So, as we can see here, the very first data point is January 2nd, 2023, which corresponds to the first week of 2023. And as we can clearly see here, the main column, the very first one, is essentially the business KPI itself. So, that is, we have the number of bottles of our lemonade sold. Next, as listed, we have the same names from the Dataset Glossary tab with our activities, regional TV and ratings, OLV advertising and impressions, price changes, and of course, the seasonal index. Alright, let's try to carefully analyze and take a visual look at the overall trends, exploring what kind of dynamics we can expect, what we'll be working with going forward, and what key information we can draw from this particular tab. So, as mentioned earlier, the actual period we're discussing spans from 2023 through the end of 2024. And now we're looking at the sales dynamics for our lemonade, measured in bottles. We see that at the beginning of 2023, the average sales volume was around 60,000 units. Later on, there were some noticeable spikes, most likely related to the advertising efforts. But we'll find out more about that later, which, in turn, significantly affected the change in the base sales level. We can see that this segment here already amounts to about 85,000 sales per week. So, there is some kind of increase. It's not clear yet what it's related to. Basically, that's what we'll figure out, right? And then there are some more spikes appearing as well here. Let's go ahead and take a look at the actual dynamics of the TV ratings. We can see that over 2 years, there were 4 main flights, meaning 2 flights per year. Over this period, the historical maximum was approximately 500 ratings per week, and the minimum was about 200 ratings per week. In digital advertising, specifically with OLV advertising, the placements were significantly fewer overall. In fact, there was just one small flight in April-May 2023, right at the very beginning of the category's seasonal peak. And there was a second, more intensive flight in May-June that even partially extended into July of 2024. Well, regarding the price change, we've already covered that here. Right here is exactly where the price increased by 40%. That is, starting specifically from November 2023 onwards. And the seasonal index, which tells us that during the summer period, in peak season, we start to see organic spikes in the category. Let's move on to the next tab, Dataset Budget. It partially duplicates the structure of the Dataset Metrics tab, and it displays information about the actual spending for all marketing channels. Alright, so as we can see, we have 2 main ones here, regional television and OLV advertising. To begin with, let's go ahead and calculate exactly how much investment was actually allocated to each channel over the entire 2-year period. As we can see, over the 2-year period, a total of 4.3 million euros were invested in regional TV advertising. Meanwhile, OLV advertising received significantly less overall, just 400,000 euros. So, the total investment amounted to 4,720,000 euros over the 2 years, from the beginning of 2023 through the end of 2024. Alright, let's now move on to the Dataset Costs tab. Here we'll take a look at the historical placement cost per advertising contact. As we can see here, in regional TV advertising specifically, the cost of one rating point was 900 euros. Meanwhile, the cost per impression in OLV advertising was 0.004 euros. And now let's take a look at the final optimization tab. We'll need it a bit later, but still, maybe we can already spot some important information here that we should take into account for further analysis and when building the model. There are 2 main channels in the media split, regional television and OLV advertising. And we need to consider the following optimization scenario for 2025. We have a budget of 2 million euros. We need to determine the optimal media mix to maximize sales volume for 2025. Now, the placement strategy might actually coincide with a seasonal category spike, specifically focusing on the summer months, which makes perfect sense, and also the late spring months, right? So, April and May. And next up, there's even more detailed information here about the optimization that needs to be implemented. So the period is, we're specifically talking about the year 2025, with a total budget of 2 million euros to be optimized across all the channels. This includes information about the minimum and maximum weights we can potentially allocate during optimization, which is directly related to the maximum capacities that can actually be purchased in each channel, or the minimum capacities. And we see that in regional TV advertising, the minimum volume of weight we can purchase is 50 ratings, and the maximum is 600 ratings per week. Now, for OLV advertising, the minimum weight per week is set at 2 million impressions. There is no max weight at all. In other words, it is assumed that any media volumes recommended by the model can be purchased on partner platforms. We've looked at an example of a brief filled out by the client. Now let's transfer this brief into the MediaMix platform for analysis. And after that, we'll build our MediaMix model. Here is the page for our MediaMix, and first, we need to create a new product. The metric we're modeling is sales, the category is consumer goods, and the scenario is professional. The MediaMix asks whether we have historical data for further analysis. Yes, we do, according to the brief and the dataset provided in the brief. We're creating a model with weekly granularity. Next, we're prompted to enter the main factors that will be considered in the model. According to the brief, we have 4 of them. The first significant media factor affecting sales is regional television advertising, which is measured in ratings, with an average cost per rating point of €900 per week. Next, we have OLV advertising, which falls under the digital block, measured in impressions. The cost is €0.004 per impression. And the other 2 factors here are not media factors, but rather external ones, namely seasonality and price changes. Click the Save button. We've added all the main factors. Next, we need to enter the historical budget that was actually implemented by the company, according to the dataset. So, let's call this the budget for 2023 to 2024. And based on all the data, a total of €4,720,000 was spent over the entire period. Now, the full period we considered in the analysis was from January 2nd, 2023, all the way through December 29th, 2024. We need to allocate the budget across the different media channels the brand used. One of them is TV advertising. We enter the budget here. The other one is digital advertising, for €100,000 over 2 years. As we can see, we have distributed the entire budget historically, according to the data from the client's dataset from the brief. At this stage, we input the values, the historical cost per contact for each channel. Let's double check for consistency just in case. So, for regional TV, it's €900 per rating point, and for OLV advertising, it's €0.004 per impression. Let's move to the Dataset Cost tab. Yes, that's correct, 900 and €0.004. Let's move on to the next step. There's no need to fill out the calendar here, since we're going to distribute all these values weekly, based on historical data. Now we need to fill out the dataset, transferring it from the brief into the platform. The first thing we need to enter is sales. Let's go to the Dataset Metrics tab, where they were displayed, and copy all the values into this section. Next, OLV advertising is entered into the model and impressions. Alright, so at this stage we enter the price change as an event index. Then we also go ahead and copy the regional TV ratings data. Seasonality must also be entered in the form of an index. And next is the unit price indicator, which represents the cost of a bottle, the actual retail price in absolute values. Once all data is entered, we click Save button. Alright, let's now move on to the next stage, namely, setting up the key parameters for building the model. Accordingly, here you can see all the main factors that will be taken into account in our model. These are OLV, regional TV advertising, price changes, and seasonality. First, we need to set the expected signs of influence. That is, we expect that OLV and regional TV advertising will boost the sales, meaning they will be evaluated with a positive sign. At the same time, we generally assume that price changes will have a negative effect overall. In other words, an increase in price negatively affected the sales of our brand, its main SKU. And seasonality is also a positive factor because category sales growth should also drive up the brand sales since it operates within this category. So next up, we need to carefully set the lags, meaning the expected delay before ads start affecting sales, for all the channels that will be considered in our analysis. But for now, we generally assume that the impact starts almost immediately, that is, as soon as the ad is launched. Some initial effects begin to appear right away. Let's go ahead and test this hypothesis. Note that the maximum allowable decay parameter for carryover effect is 70% for TV and 90% for digital advertising. These are the average market benchmarks that we will use. These are the maximum allowable values. To set the saturation point for a channel, we set the maximum historical metric value, after which the channel reaches its peak investment potential. So we will assume that for TV advertising, this saturation point will be reached at the very highest historical weight, especially since the channel actually approaches the maximum capacity, about 600 rating points, meaning 600 rating points per week according to the optimization tab in the client's brief. For digital advertising, we'll set this value to 3. Click Save. And we assume, based on the observed sales dynamics, that there is a buildup in the sales base. Let's assume that this is happening precisely due to media placements. To find these media effects, we need to add long-term effects for each advertising channel. First, for regional TV, we also expect a positive impact with a lag of at least 1 week. In other words, these particular effects start to appear only after some time, under the long-term column Choose Awareness from the drop-down list. Regional television. I click the Save button. And we also want to add long-term effects here for OLV advertising, using exactly the same basic principle, a positive effect with a maximum lag of 1 week. Our model specification setup is ready. So, the hypotheses we want to test are, once again, we want to understand how OLV advertising and regional TV advertising affected sales in the short term, meaning the immediate effects. At the same time, we also want to check how a price change negatively impacted the brand sales. What additional effect does the seasonal component actually have overall, and what other long-term effects can be observed specifically from regional TV and OLV advertising? Here, we set some basic operational parameters for how deeply we want to search for viable solutions in our analytical process. And we click the Build Model button. In this video lesson, we've also gone through a few more steps together. Specifically, we learned how to transfer information from the brief into the MediaMix platform, and we figured out how to actually build the model itself. Now, let's export the results from this built model and try to interpret them. We'll also address some of the key tasks the client included in the brief, such as evaluate the impact of our different marketing channels and identify the potential limits of our TV and OLV channels. And finally, at this stage, we'll be able to test our client's hypothesis that the increase in the retail price per bottle in November 2023 had a minimal impact on sales volume. This is the exported calculator based on the model, meaning it's a model report in Excel format. It also contains a variety of different tabs. For this video tutorial, we'll need just a few of them. The main ones are dashboard, model stats, plan, and response curves. Let's start with the dashboard tab. The dashboard tab is essentially the tab that contains all of the aggregated information about the brand, meaning its historical sales, its media effectiveness, its ROI indicators, the key metrics that were entered into the model, and so on. So, this is a unified monitoring tab for everything happening with the brand based on the data presented in the brief and later displayed in the MediaMix platform. What do we see here? First of all, let's take a closer look at this chart, specifically at what was actually built based on the model. The blue line on this chart represents the actual sales volume from the brief, according to the dataset. And the red line is what we modeled using our platform. We can clearly see, even visually, that the match is very close. The two lines almost coincide. In other words, it means that we described the historical placement and the historical sales trends of the brand, of its main SKU, the lemonades, quite well. On the right, there are two basic characteristics shown. These are statistical metrics that assess how accurate a model is. So MAPE-train is the mean absolute percentage error on the model's training period, meaning the period during which we search for relationships between factors and KPIs and determine the influence coefficients of each factor. MAPE test is the same indicator for the period during which we tested the predictive power of the model. We can see that both MAPE values vary around 3% and 2%. Some benchmarks for better understanding, less than 20% is considered an acceptable result, less than 15 is good, and less than 10 is an excellent result for describing history and forecasting the future. In our case, we achieved an outstanding result. And let's move on. So, the main takeaway here is that the model described the historical data well. Moreover, let's go straight to the Model Stats tab, which displays various mathematical characteristics of the built model, namely the model specification, factor significance, for example. Here we can see that everything is at a high level of significance for each factor. And then, in this section, the key statistical metrics are presented. Overall, looking at all of these, we can also see that there are no issues, no penalties, and no problems with the mathematical tests. Here, the value 0 is shown everywhere. This means the highest possible rating for the model construction. Additional tests for multicollinearity are also presented in this table. We see that all the values are less than 5, and it indicates that there is no correlation between the factors, which could have distorted the results obtained from the model. We can see that everything is excellent in terms of mathematical and technical components of the model. But now let's move on to the practical results. Let's first take a look at this chart, which is called KPI versus budget fact. On the x-axis here, we have the weekly investment volume in the channel. We have two historical channels, regional television and OLV advertising. And on the y-axis, it's the weekly sales increase from that investment volume at the average cost per contact. Let me remind you, that's 900 euros per one rating point on television and 0.004 euros per one impression in OLV advertising. And so what do we see here on this chart? Now, we can observe that at the specific investment volume that covers this particular range and stops at this point, at the value shown here, it's OLV advertising that performs optimally and most effectively for the brand overall, yielding the best possible results. In other words, within this specific budget range, OLV advertising is more effective than television advertising. You see, it's above TV here. Alright, so when investing within this budget range, according to the model's results, it's best to allocate money into OLV advertising because it gives us the greatest overall effect. But later on, if investment continues, the brand needs to add regional TV to the mix to expand capacity because OLV advertising stops delivering any noticeable results here. Next, let's take a closer look at the effects of each individual channel. So, the very first task the client set, according to the brief, let's go back to it, was to determine the impact of each marketing channel. That's what the next section is for. The contributions section. Here we see effects from each channel in absolute values at every point in time, year by year. For example, OLV advertising contributed to 101,909 additional bottles of lemonade sold in 2023. For 2024, this number is already 533,645 bottles. Also note that the effect of OLV advertising is divided into two components, short-term and long-term. Short-term is the immediate effect we get from advertising. So, we run an ad and people start buying and trying the brand or product right away after learning about it. And the long-term effects are essentially the repeat purchases, when the audience becomes truly loyal and starts buying our product regularly over a long period of time. We can say the same thing about TV advertising. So, here we assess the value, I mean the effects, in absolute terms for each marketing channel. But let's take a look at the relative figures. So, if we consider that all sales the brand had during the period from 2023 through 2024 make up 100%, then what portion of that 100% can be explained by OLV advertising, TV advertising, and other factors? We see that OLV advertising accounts for a total of 5% of sales during the period from 2023 to 2024. Regional TV advertising, which had significantly more investment, accounts for about 40% of the contribution. That is, it explains 40% of the sales. By the way, let's check the client's hypothesis, which they included in the brief. The client assumed that the impact of price change was not that significant, that a 40% price increase did not have that much effect on sales. That's right, the negative effect was only 6%, which is quite small relative to 100. The client was right, and their hypothesis was confirmed in this case. Next is seasonality. We see that the sales growth in the category occurs during the periods described in the briefing. This factor also contributes to the sales, namely it explains 6% of the total sales. And everything else is the base, the initial sales base. So what does that mean? It's the volume of sales the brand would have if it didn't invest in TV advertising or in OLV advertising, and if there were no changes in price. In other words, if the price remained stable at €3.50, and if there were no seasonal component at all. So, if the brand had a steady season throughout the year, then it would get this volume of sales and would continue to get it in the future. Well, we've completed the client's first task. Now let's go ahead and do the third task from the brief, namely determine some investment potential for each of the channels involved. For this, we'll definitely need the response curves tab, which actually shows us the return, the response function of each individual channel based on the amount of investment allocated to it. In this case, on the x-axis of these graphs on the left, you can see the metric that was input into the model. So, on the x-axis for OLV, it's impressions, on the x-axis for TV, it's weekly rating points, and on the y-axis, it's the weekly sales increase for both. And we see that regional TV advertising has almost reached its maximum potential for investment. The typical value here is the average historical weight that this channel has had. The maximum metric, accordingly, is the maximum historical weight. And the inflection and saturation points represent a certain range that is effective for investing in this channel. So, as we can see here, historically the brand has been within the effective investment range, and it still is now. But at the same time, any further increase will not bring any additional sales. Accordingly, the model now suggests that we shouldn't increase the weekly channel weight any further beyond this. At the same time, things are looking a bit different with the OLV channel here. That is, we see that the brand is also within the effective investment range between the inflection and saturation points. And the historical average value is, well, within that range, the maximum is also within it, and there is still a margin of safety, a reserve of potential for further investment. So, we see that the weight for OLV advertising can be increased. This will result in additional sales. At the same time, let's pay attention to the long-term effects of our two channels, namely regional television and OLV advertising. So, what do we see? Here on the charts to the right, there's a good visualization of how these long-term effects have changed over time, starting from 2023 and ending at the end of 2024. We can see that TV advertising had quite significant effects at first. This is the orange line, when the first flights were just launched. But later on, we see that it reaches a plateau. In other words, there is no further increase in the base due to TV advertising. That is, the channel capacity is already reaching its limit. And this is clearly visible on this chart as well. So, we see that the maximum long-term effects have almost been reached in TV advertising. As for OLV advertising, we see a similar picture here when it comes to short-term effects. The potential reserve is still quite substantial. In other words, we see that there is still a large range for growth. Therefore, the primary and most significant recommendation that we will utilize to construct the optimized media split, or that we will test and evaluate within our scenarios, is essentially to increase the brand's marketing presence on digital platforms because, as I've said, the historical data analysis shows that there is still enough potential for both long-term and immediate short-term effects and benefits within that particular domain. TV advertising, meanwhile, may be used in optimization flights to maximize returns at specific moments, such as during category sales growth seasons, in the spring and summer months, and so on. So, we have also answered this question from the client. But going forward, of course, as part of the optimization process, we will pay more attention to all the numbers, specifically how they will look in terms of sales. We will address the second task a little later. Actually, we will combine the solutions to the second and fourth tasks as part of the optimization scenarios. And we also tested the hypothesis and saw that the impact of the price change is not as significant as might have been expected. The negative impact is not serious enough. That's good. Let's also take a brief look at the dashboard tab to see what is currently displayed there, so that going forward we clearly understand what else we can actually show and present to the client in the final report document. Let's switch back to displaying absolute values and take a look at the breakdown of the tabs. This chart here shows us the distribution of effects across different channels by month, starting from the beginning of 2023 according to the model, and going through to 2024. And here, each color represents a different channel and its effects. For example, with TV advertising, the purple color represents the immediate effects, the short-term effects. And these lilac segments, well, actually these turquoise segments, represent the long-term effects from TV advertising. We can see that before the actual placement, these effects naturally didn't exist. They only started to appear sometime shortly after the first flight. And they kept growing and basically reached their peak by the end of the fourth flight, after the placement of the fourth flight in August-September of 2024. But at the same time, the segments are quite substantial. So, the size of each segment shows how strongly each factor affects sales according to the model. And again, we see OLV advertising. Its short-term and long-term effects were pretty weak at the beginning. Here, as I mentioned, there was only a small flight of OLV advertising, but after that, the effects started to increase significantly. And we saw that this channel still has potential for further investment, even more so than TV advertising. Let's also take a look at the growth factors section. So, we want to understand what kind of growth occurred over an equal period of time by comparing 2024 to 2023. Total sales growth amounted to 25.5%. And we also want to understand what exactly contributed to this growth. So if we add up the effects of OLV and TV advertising, as well as the price change, that's how we get the 25.5% figure in the bottom right corner. In other words, we see that this 25.5% year-over-year sales growth over 52 weeks of each year was achieved primarily due to regional TV placements. So, TV advertising was the main driver of sales growth for the main SKU of the brand's natural ingredient lemonade during this period, that is, in 2024 compared to 2023. At the same time, the price change during this period accounted for only 10% of the total. Well, not that significant. OLV advertising contributed 8% of the growth out of that 25.5%. So, basically, because the initial investment volume was relatively small, this percentage is now a bit overshadowed by the TV advertising results, right? But going forward, we'll look again at what can be done to maximize the effect in 2025. And let's take a look at the last section displayed here, marketing efficiency. Right now, it includes the following information. First column is the metrics. This is the metric for each channel that was entered into the model. So, for OLV, it's impressions, and for TV advertising, it's rating points. In 2024, for example, the brand purchased 2,600 rating points. And in 2023, for instance, 2,200 rating points were purchased. Over the entire period, that's a total of 4,800 ratings. Next, we have the actual budgets spent as well. These are all the investments the brand made, according to the dataset. Budget share per channel. So, in 2023, OLV advertising made up 3% of the total split in terms of investment volume, and in 2024, it was about 13%. Now, the effects of each individual channel. This shows the share of sales among all these different channels. Well, basically, these are contributions in percentages, but now within the media split. And so on. Various characteristics are presented here. Let's take a closer look at one of the key metrics calculated for this category, ROS, which is equal to the revenue from each channel at any given time, divided by the money invested in it, or its budget. We can see that right now all the values are in the positive range for both groups of channels. So first we have OLV advertising. This is the total, and here we have the short-term effect and the long-term effect. And the same applies to television advertising. That's it. And we can actually see that television advertising brings the biggest effect in terms of the number of sales, but at the same time, its short-term ROS value, for example, was 1.2 in 2024, and it is lower than that of digital advertising, which was 2.7 in 2024. So this actually shows that regional TV advertising is already reaching its peak. And we see additional potential in OLV advertising. So, we've analyzed our model, addressed two of the client's tasks, and tested their hypothesis. But we still have two more tasks left from the brief. First, to calculate the payback period for the client's TV and OLV advertising. And second, to develop an effective strategy with a planned budget of 2 million euros for 2025 and generate a sales forecast for that period. To solve these, we need to build some optimization scenarios. Let's go ahead and create a few optimization scenarios together using the information we've just gathered and the effectiveness calculator generated by the model. Alright, for this specific task, we'll need to revisit the Optimization tab again, where we originally set the constraints from the client for this particular optimization process. We need to go over to the Budget tab and actually create these different scenarios there. Let's assume there will be 3 of them. Now, the first one is that the brand invests in several TV flights in May and June, for example, during the peak season for the category. And digital will also be running actively during this same period, from May all the way through August, when the category really picks up momentum. Let's go ahead and set up this scenario first. So, we click Add Budget. Let's name it 2 TV flights. The budget we need to allocate in this optimization scenario is 2 million euros. That's the figure we enter here. For the period from the beginning of 2025 to the end of 2025. Now, let's begin the process of setting up the flights and their respective placement periods. The first will be TV in May. The second, we'll add TV in June. Well, we have created 2 flights. And we do the same for OLV advertising. We had the first flight in May. The second flight will be in June. And in this scenario, we agreed to test OLV advertising for the period from May through August. Next, we need to set the restrictions that were provided by the client. First, for OLV impressions. The minimum volume that can be purchased is 2 million impressions. There is no maximum. For TV advertising, the minimum is 50 rating points and the maximum is 600. Another important thing to do is to take into account inflation for the next year. Even though the client didn't provide any information on this, we have to account for it as specialists. Let's assume it will be 10%. That means the cost per contact will change to these values. And now let's actually find the optimal media split within the configuration we've set. So, once again, 2 TV flights in May and June, each lasting 4 weeks. As for OLV advertising, it runs in the peak season from May through August, inclusive. The optimization was successful. All that's left is to set the plan values for price and seasonality for future periods. These 2 factors are also taken into account in the model, so they absolutely need to be included later on to refine the forecast for the entire year of 2025. Let's move to the Dataset Metrics tab in the brief. Here we can see that the client has kindly set the plan values for the cost per bottle for the upcoming period. Well, they don't intend to change this price. At the moment, there is no change in price, so it remains as it was, and the seasonal index is kept for our future periods. So, we assume that the category's organic sales growth will continue at about the same rate as before, both in 2023 and in 2024. Let's download this report with this optimization scenario. So, we have obtained a total sales forecast of 7,700,080 bottles for 2025. This result is based on the set optimization constraints and the identified scenario. The goal was to spend 2 million euros as efficiently as possible within the calendar we created, which includes 2 regional TV flights in May and June, and digital activities from May through August. So, here's a demonstration of how sales for the upcoming period might look. And let's first take a closer look at growth factors section here. Now there's a specific column here for 2025 when compared to 2024. In other words, these are the planned, forecasted values. What do we see here? We see that, according to the optimization scenario, this growth for 2025 compared to 2024 is slowing down naturally. Because the long-term effects of TV advertising have already been exhausted, according to what we observed in the model's results. But there are still effects from OLV advertising, as it hasn't reached the saturation point. And we see that now this channel is the main growth driver. Short-term effects account for 8% out of these 11.8%. 5.8% comes from the long-term effects. At the same time, in regional TV advertising, there are currently negative percentages in the short-term effects. A possible reason for that is the reallocation of investments from regional TV to digital, and we'll look at that further. So, the short-term effect of TV advertising in 2025 compared to 2024 has dropped because of this. But in terms of the maximum sales volume that can be achieved, this is the most optimal solution. Let's see how this situation looks on a chart for better understanding. Yes, indeed, we can see a significant amount of investment in OLV advertising. In fact, the volumes even increased compared to the last flight in 2024, the actual one that took place. At the same time, there is significantly less investment in these two TV flights because the channel reached its saturation point, and TV is also quite expensive compared to OLV advertising. We saw this earlier in the graph showing response curves from media investments. We can see that OLV is above TV here. Now, let's take a closer look at this on the Plan tab. Here, you can actually see the specific chart by channel. OLV advertising, regional TV advertising, and so on. The actual and plan placements are shown in the following white block. We see that with the allocated budget for TV advertising, about 175 rating points are purchased per week in the first flight. Then 50 rating points are bought weekly to maximize the short-term effect. We see additional placements in the second flight, made according to the client's restrictions. And that's actually how we get the total sales volume. I mean this figure here, 7,700,080 bottles for 2025. At the same time, it's important to understand that the media effect, of course, isn't that big because there's also the baseline sales level we discussed earlier. Accordingly, the total media contribution to sales for 2025 will be about 1,350,826 bottles. OLV advertising will contribute 1 million bottles, and TV advertising 307,000 bottles, which is significantly less. So, we've had a resplit. The media split has changed drastically. Note that OLV advertising now accounts for almost 62% of the split, well, 61.5% to be exact. And TV advertising makes up 38.5% of media investments. So you can see that our hypothesis, which we tested in the optimization scenario, that it's more profitable now to shift the investment volume to OLV advertising, is confirmed. Now, using this chart, we can solve one of the main tasks set by the client in the brief. That is, to assess the payback period of media investments for each channel. Over what period of time will these investments pay off? Let's take a look here. So, first, we need to enter the margin. The margin is 30%. It's entered here in the current field. It's assumed that the brand earns 30% from each bottle sold. Now, pay attention to the ROMI row. This is exactly the payback of media investments. If the value is 0 or higher, it means the brand earns something for every euro invested. If the value is negative, the brand does not make money there. And now, the period under consideration we have here is until the end of 2025. So, we can see that this placement period on May 26th, 2025, with a budget of 67,000 euros, will fully pay off in 32 weeks. So, on average, the payback for OLV advertising is achieved in 32 weeks. The fact that the values here are shown as negative is simply because we are now limiting the review period to the end of 2025, but in fact, if we extend it to 2026, after some time these values will also become positive. Now let's turn our attention to television advertising. The situation here is much worse. Let's look at the placement during the period we selected. Even if we take the very first point, the first observation, where the brand spends 171,809 euros per week, these investments do not pay off over a period of 36 weeks. And the ROMI here is minus 0.53. Let's suppose the ads run in an earlier period, for example, starting from the first week of 2025. Notice that the ROMI is still negative, minus 0.49. We come to a very important conclusion here. TV advertising has stopped paying off. In other words, no matter which placement we choose in TV advertising, it won't pay off in the near future, not in a year, or even 2 years. Why is this happening? It's precisely because the long-term effects have been depleted. Here, as we can see, these additional effects are practically near zero. Why do I say that it has stopped paying off? That is, before it probably did pay off. Let's look at historical placements. Even here, the placements were already not paying off. And here we see positive values, meaning it paid off. So, the third historical flight was still generating a positive return. But then the effects started to wear off. So, from the standpoint of media investment profitability, the right decision would have been not to purchase the fourth flight because it was no longer driving enough sales, meaning the brand simply wasn't making money on it. With the help of the optimization scenario calculator, we also completed the second task. We haven't fully solved the fourth task yet because we want to test 2 more additional scenarios, for example, when there is just 1 TV flight instead of 2, given that TV advertising doesn't pay off, according to what we have learned. But the brand still wants to spend 2 million euros a year. So, we want to see what will happen, how the sales forecast and overall business metrics will change if there is just 1 TV flight. And the third scenario is if the brand turns off TV advertising and only keeps its presence in digital. So, let's actually look at these 2 additional scenarios. According to the client's assignment, the media budget for 2025 is 2 million euros. Let's calculate the scenario with 1 TV flight in May, hitting the peak of the season, and OLV advertising around the same time. It can actually be launched even earlier, in April, because there is available money that has been freed up after one TV flight was cancelled. Also, it is more profitable for the brand to take more of the season in order to increase its presence. So let's try to actually do that. That is, the TV flight in May starts from this week on April 28th. For digital, let's have placements from the beginning of April through the end of August. Let's consider this scenario. We also need to set the same restrictions. As for inflation, we assume it will be plus 10% year over year. The minimum weight in digital is 2 million impressions, with no maximum, and for TV advertising it's 50 and 600 raring points, respectively. Then we click here to optimize the scenario that we specified. The budget has been created. We also need to set the projected price change for the upcoming period, exactly the same way as in the previous scenario. Click the Save button. Here we can download a detailed Excel report for this specific scenario. And let's go ahead and create the next, final scenario, so we can just compare them all afterwards. In this scenario, there is no TV advertising at all. The total media budget for this campaign remains the same, 2 million euros. Let's consider the same time period so that the entire season from March to August is fully covered. Inflation is plus 10%, and minimum weight for OLV is 2 million impressions. This is the minimum volume of inventory that the client is willing to purchase from partner platforms where they will place their online video ads. And we are looking for the ideal solution. Now we also need to incorporate the price change and seasonal index for the future period into the current scenario to get a final sales volume forecast. We click the Save button, download the latest report, and start comparing them with each other to figure out which scenario we will recommend to the client. We'll look at the numbers right now. Let's begin with the first scenario we created. We can jump to the media contribution right away. We'll get to total sales forecast later. We'll provide the client with the final information so they understand what they'll get, taking other factors into account. For now, we'll evaluate only the media contribution. So, in the scenario with 2 TV flights, this will be the media contribution. Let's put that number down here for now. This is just for us to help us choose the optimal scenario. In the scenario with 1 TV flight, this will be the media contribution to sales volume according to the forecast. And in the last scenario, where we only have digital, this will be the media contribution. And what do we actually see here? Indeed, there is some oversaturation in TV advertising and also overspending, as it's a very expensive channel and the long-term effects are wearing off. For this reason, having 2 TV flights during the year is quite expensive and not effective in terms of maximizing sales. At the same time, a purely digital strategy, where we completely turn off TV advertising, also will not bring the maximum effect among the 3 scenarios. When we choose this strategy for a shorter period of time, the OLV channel becomes oversaturated. This also leads to the channel reaching its maximum historical weight. Now, pay attention. Right here, we're already approaching the maximum historical weights. This strategy is also not particularly effective for maximizing sales potential, because the primary objective is to spend exactly 2 million euros, not a euro less. Naturally, if we were working with a significantly smaller budget, this strategy would be the most suitable choice. But since the goal is to maximize sales, we're not focusing on the profitability of TV investments right now, because that's not the objective. So we're just looking for sales maximization opportunities, basically setting ROI aside, because it's not relevant here. At the same time, we understand that we must bring this information to the client's attention so they notice it, because they may simply not have considered this option. Within the scope of this analysis, we understand that the recommended strategy, given the defined constraints and the required annual budget of 2 million euros, is a single TV flight. This strategy delivers the maximum effect from media advertising. Yes, that's our recommendation. At the same time, it makes sense for the client to reconsider the media budget for 2025. It might be reasonable to reduce it slightly if the placement period remains within the peak category season. The point is that right now we're also limited by the season. The client only wants placements from April through August. That's why we reach a plateau in effectiveness during this set period, and after that, there's simply nowhere else to invest the money. Otherwise, the channels would become oversaturated. So, if the brand continues to operate within this paradigm without launching ads in January, February, or during the fall months at the end of the year, then the recommendation would be to slightly decrease the media budget to avoid overspending on regional TV. That doesn't pay off. However, if there's an opportunity to extend the period, whether that's due to a strategic decision or broader company goals, then that changes the picture. If the brand decides to add a few more months to the campaign, then of course it's worth doing in order to spend the full marketing budget of 2 million euros per year. That will be our recommendation within the framework of this analysis, based on the information and results we've obtained. We've built the optimization scenarios and addressed the client's remaining two tasks. Now we can move on to preparing the final report. Let's start with the basic information, the model and its accuracy. We'll stick with the scenario we've selected as the recommended option, based on the client's task requirements. This is the scenario with a single TV flight. We want to demonstrate that the model is accurate. We'll also specify the plan period for which the forecast was made. In addition, we'll provide the model specification, which essentially means the equations. And of course, the mathematical tests will definitely include those in the final report as well. This will clearly show that all the patterns we've identified are certainly not just random occurrences, and that we really did find the correct influence coefficients of the model's factors. The next section is the decomposition of contributions. Here, we want to show a visual representation of the effects of all the factors in the model. Let's also indicate the plan period on the graph along with the corresponding forecast. Now, as part of our analysis, we'll also include the distribution of factor contributions by year, both in absolute values and, of course, as percentages, to ensure clarity and actionable insights. As we've seen, this is very useful, especially if we consider total sales as 100%. Then we need to briefly summarize the main conclusions we've reached. According to the model's results, the total contribution of TV advertising over the entire period under review, including the planned period for 2025, was approximately 36.3%. Let's describe it similarly for OLV advertising. According to the model, OLV advertising accounted for 21.7% of total sales during the period under review. And regarding price, let's address the question about the impact of the price change. Actually, its negative effect wasn't as significant as some might have expected. The client's hypothesis was also that the impact of the price change wasn't too significant. The overall impact of the price change was minus 8.3%. Here, we've outlined the basic information about the influence of all factors according to the model. All advertising accounted for approximately 58% of total sales, meaning it's the brand's main growth driver. Now let's fill in the information on the response curves for each channel. To do this, I suggest we add this graph. So here, we're showing the potential of each channel, specifically that OLV advertising can deliver stronger short-term effects at low weekly investment levels, like the ones presented here. And let's also include the potentials, not for this investment level, but specifically for the metrics that are purchased for each channel. These are impressions for OLV and rating points for regional TV advertising. Of course, we also need to add some comments here. But before we do that, let's make sure to add a description of the long-term effects just below these graphs, because that's a very important point. So, when it comes to the long-term effects of OLV advertising, we can see that the potential is still quite significant. Let's add this information here. Now I'm adding the graph for regional TV advertising. Here, we can see that its potential for long-term effects has already been exhausted. So let's go ahead and write that down. Here, we've described the potential for long-term effects. As a result, we've come to a second conclusion. To increase the effectiveness of marketing investments in terms of sales maximization based on the objective set by the client, it is necessary to reduce the number of TV flights, as their potential has already been exhausted. At the same time, there is an effective weight range in TV advertising that still delivers short-term impact. Therefore, in this scenario, it shouldn't be completely excluded unless the focus is strictly on ROI. This is the scenario we recommend implementing. And of course, moving forward, we'll also include our findings on the ROI of each channel, their payback periods, and how to act on that information. We'll begin with the breakdown of the ROI metrics. The brand earns a 30% margin on each bottle sold. With that margin, the average payback period for OLV advertising is 32 weeks. For TV advertising, even in the optimization scenario, a positive ROI is never achieved. In fact, this isn't limited to the optimization scenario. It's clear that in any future case, TV advertising will not deliver a positive marketing ROI. This should be carefully considered when deciding which strategy to pursue moving forward. So let's move on to the main recommendation itself. What exactly do we suggest doing right now? Our recommendation is to run a single TV flight and maintain sustained digital placements from April through August inclusive. Let's add this chart here now. It shows the investment allocation. Here, let's specify that this is a strategy with a single TV flight. And here we'll provide a brief description of this media split, meaning, how is it structured? Let's go back to the calculator again. In this split, TV advertising accounts for 24.6% of the budget, while OLV advertising makes up the remaining 75.4%, according to the scenario. Let's answer the client's question. What exactly will they achieve with this plan? Compared to 2024, they'll see a 13.5% increase in sales. This growth will come mainly from the long-term effects of digital advertising. That's where the majority of customer acquisition will happen. We'll show that now. Of course, it's important to explain to the client what exactly these long-term effects refer to. As I mentioned at the very beginning of this video lesson, they generate repeat purchases and help build a loyal audience. So, advertising captures people's interest in the moment, and over time, they begin to convert. That's what we mean by long-term effects. Now we're going to add this table with the growth figures here, so it's clear what drives this growth. We should definitely include this in the presentation. And now we'll also add the total sales forecast. This is something the client specifically requested for the full year of 2025. Right here is the sales statistics table with the forecast. So let's add it to the presentation. At the same time, it's very important to emphasize that if the budget allocation changes, the recommendations may also change accordingly. This is a key point that should not be overlooked. I've emphasized this point already, but it's worth repeating. If the spending target changes, for example, if the goal is to spend less than 2 million euros, then the recommendation would be to exclude TV advertising from the media mix altogether. This is because, as we've discussed, the marketing ROI of TV advertising is negative. In other words, it's simply not a profitable investment. So, if the placement period is not extended, it will be necessary to reduce the investment volume. But if the period is extended, we'll need to run some additional calculations. And that's exactly what we'll elaborate on here in the extra information section. It will give the marketing team some additional food for thought, specifically whether this goal, set either by the marketing department or the commercial department, truly needs to remain as it is or should be reconsidered. We recommend considering one of two scenarios, given that TV advertising is already showing a negative ROI. In other words, either reduce the media budget if the placement period remains unchanged. And we specify the exact period here. Or extend the placement period. So, these are the key takeaways we include in reports like this to ensure the client has a clear understanding of what's happening with their brand. Our report is ready. Now, let's go over the key takeaways from our analysis. Just a reminder, during our analysis, we focused 4 main tasks set by the client. First, determining the impact of their different marketing channels. Second, calculating the payback period for their TV and OLV advertising. Third, identifying the potential limits of their TV and OLV channels. And fourth, developing an effective strategy with a planned budget of 2 million euros for 2025 and creating a sales forecast. The client also asked us to test the hypothesis that the increase in the retail price per bottle in November 2023 had a minimal impact on sales volume. So, what did we find out? Let's sum it up. First of all, the model accurately described historical performance and produced a forecast for the future. All model estimates proved to be highly accurate. The model also passed all mathematical validation tests, confirming that the results are not coincidental. The patterns we identified are real. Next, we determined the impact of each channel, which is called the decomposition of contributions. We found that all media placements, given the planned budget for 2025 of 2 million euros, accounted for approximately 58% of total sales during this period. The price change had a negative impact, as expected. We identified this effect, but it accounted for only minus 8.3% relative to total sales volume, based on a 100% contribution scale. So, it's not really significant. In other words, the client's hypothesis was confirmed. The impact was minimal. Next, we assess the potential of each channel. In the case of OLV advertising, we found that there is still considerable potential, both in terms of short-term impact and long-term effects, such as building a loyal audience and encouraging repeat purchases. Meanwhile, with regional TV advertising, we observed that the channel has already reached a saturation point. According to our calculations, the channel has reached its limit in both short-term and long-term effects, making additional investment unprofitable. This is also clearly reflected in the investment response curves, where the x-axis represents weekly investment volumes. Here, OLV advertising demonstrates a better result. In other words, it outperforms TV advertising at this investment volume, within this range. We determined that reducing the number of TV flights is not only acceptable, but actually recommended. In addition, we evaluated the payback of the media investments for 2025. OLV advertising will pay off in 32 weeks, assuming a 30% margin per bottle sold. TV advertising, on the other hand, simply will pay off in the near future, just because all the effects have been exhausted. And accordingly, this will lead to our further recommendation, which we will discuss on slide 8. But if we take the client's task to spend 2 million euros in 2025 without reducing the budget, then out of the 3 proposed scenarios, the most effective one in terms of generating the highest sales volume is the scenario with a single TV flight. Even though the marketing ROI of this channel is negative in the near term, this option delivers the best results under the set constraints. The proposed media split is significantly different from the historical one, namely, TV advertising is reduced to 25% of the total investment. while OLV advertising, by contrast, is increased to 75%. And the planned sales growth in 2025 compared to 2024 will be 13.5%. This is achieved primarily through OLV advertising as a result of increased investment in this channel. Here, we can clearly see substantial additional growth achieved as a result of the proposed strategy. At the same time, we must emphasize, and we clearly state this in the report, that if the task changes, the recommendation will also change. For example, if the budget decreases from 2 million euros per year to 1 million, or if the placement period is extended, the optimization task will need to be revisited. Right now, according to the client's requirements, we've only considered the category's peak growth period from late spring to late summer, essentially April through August. If this period is extended, the model will need to be reoptimized accordingly. And of course, we must emphasize this key takeaway, that the payback from TV advertising is negative. Given this insight, it may be necessary to slightly reconsider or adjust the initial assumptions around the marketing budget and planning for next year. One possible way the brand can approach this is to reduce the marketing budget. Now, if the brand wants to spend the full current budget within the short window from April to August, it will exhaust the short-term effects of OLV advertising. To avoid oversaturating the channel by overinvesting in OLV, the brand may shift the remaining budget to TV advertising, which is also unprofitable. That's why the media budget should be reduced. It shouldn't be 2 million euros, but something less. Another option is to extend the placement period. For example, the brand might decide to run ads throughout the entire year, including the winter months. In that case, a 2 million euro budget might indeed be sufficient to reach effective weight levels using a digital-only strategy, that is, advertising exclusively on digital channels like OLV. However, this would require additional calculations. So, we've answered all of our clients' questions, which means we've reached the end of this video lesson. As I mentioned at the beginning, today we covered steps 2, 3, 4, and 5 of our overall client workflow: brief and historical data collection, building the model results and presentation, and CAC optimizations. Here's a quick recap of what we did together. First, we looked at an example of a completed client brief and analyzed it. Then, we learned how to transfer that information directly into the MediaMix platform. After that, we walked through the entire process of building the model itself. From there, we interpreted the results and used them to answer the client's specific questions and test their hypothesis. Next, we built out a few optimization scenarios to plan for the upcoming year. And finally, we pulled all of our insights together into a sample report for the client. I hope this walkthrough was helpful. Thank you for watching. Now, if you're interested in learning more about CheckMedia's solutions, I highly recommend trying our CAC benchmark service. This free chatbot lets you quickly explore industry benchmarks for customer acquisition costs across various marketing channels. You'll learn precisely how our system allocates annual budgets, including insights into brand channels that are often overlooked.